This gunmetal gray, somewhat sleek, somewhat industrial, and very 80s little component is the Pioneer TX-055. It's a digital AM/FM radio tuner. So what made this stand out to me? I found and shown you several radio tuners already, and this one does arguably less than all of the other ones. So why did I pay $15 to bring this home and talk about it? Well, as it turns out, this is a really good example of a company making several different cost-saving decisions that effectively reflect a paradigm shift that was happening around that time. And so we're going to talk about it. Stick around. So this is the Pioneer TX-055 FM/AM Digital Synthesized Tuner. It's from 1984. I found it a couple of days ago at Revivals, which is a curated thrift store chain here in the Valley. Now, as you know, I tend to pick these things because something stands out to me about them. Strangely, what stood out to me about this one initially was how simple it is. In fact, I would say it's about as simple as you can get with one of these little digital tuners. During the 70s, Pioneer was a great audio brand. I don't mean to imply that that fact has changed, but at the time, they were producing some really cool stuff. I just picked up a couple of nice pieces by them at an estate sale, which I will hopefully get to share with you if I can get them working properly. But at the time, components were sold, for the most part, individually. Now, that's not always true, and any statement has its exceptions, but it was more true than not. However, by the time this unit was released, it was not uncommon for companies to sell complete sets of components, which would include everything from the speakers to the amp, the media players, and in some cases like this one, even the piece of furniture that it sits on. This tuner is one of the pieces that was sold as a part of a larger group. A small mystery to me is why this was the only piece that turned up at the thrift store and not the entire set, which seems to happen a lot, actually. Now, from the literature I've been able to find on this thing, I don't believe Pioneer made any pretense about these bundled sets being the pinnacle of hi-fi. They were marketed at people who wanted a complete system but were either more budget conscious or just had no experience with building a stereo system and liked the convenience of being able to just go to the good guys and buy one, which that's fine. Shoot, I edit these videos on a pre-built computer because I didn't feel like building one. The trade-off, though, was that you weren't getting the company's best fare when you got a complete system. And that makes sense because the point of these systems was to be competitive and affordable. If they were to package their top tier components, you'd need a second mortgage and that would kind of defeat the whole purpose. So coming back to this unit, why is it so basic? Well, quite simply because it wasn't really meant to be sold as a standalone product. Even if it was at times, that wasn't Pioneer's main goal in making it. It existed to fill the radio tuner role in a budget component system and didn't need to stand out or sell itself in any way. It just had to do a job. And as long as it did that singular job, that was sufficient. However, despite its simplicity, this thing does have a few noteworthy features. And it actually has a little secret too. So let's look a little closer at the unit itself. On the left is the power button. That's straightforward, but next to it, they've indicated standby/on. This unit does not have a standby function. There's no infrared sensor, there's no input on the back, and the power switch is an actual switch which cuts the power to the entire machine. The standby function actually refers to the on state of the machine, which is counterintuitive. But the reason they word it that way goes back to it being part of a component system. See, rather than expecting you to power on every single piece of the system every time you want to use it, which would have been as many as 6 or 7 different power buttons, you would have plugged this into another component on the rack along with all the other components, switched them all on, and just left them like that. Then you would have just powered on the single power amp and everything else would have come on at the same time. It made things way more convenient. The only display is a relatively small VFD, which has a very intense green color. If it was a tattoo ink, I'd say it was Fusion Gamma Green. It has 5 digits, 1 decimal dot, and indicates FM or AM and the corresponding megahertz or kilohertz. The 2 large buttons on the far right are the tuner controls, up on the right, down on the left. They of course have the same strangely shaped buttons as the power switch. To the left of those are the 8 station call buttons. If you've watched my other videos, you know those are for saving station presets so you don't have to go back and manually find a favorite station every single time. However, this is the best part. There are actually 16 presets because unlike every other tuner I've covered so far, each slot can be programmed to save an AM and an FM station independently. To save a preset, you just tune to the station, hit the memory button, the red light will come on, and you choose the preset number. Simple. To recall the station later, you just select the function, hit the same station call button, and your favorited station will immediately appear. Now this was another thing that I found a little unusual. The tuner will remain on whatever station you select when you power it off. It'll even retain that setting when it's unplugged. On top of that, even if it gets unplugged and left off for a while, every station you've saved will remain in memory. I'll show you why that's interesting when we get it open, which we'll do in a minute. Before we flip it around to the back, I want to point something out. Notice the shape of all the buttons. They're vertical, and I think there's a reason why. Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it as well. But let's flip it around first. As I said before, there is no input control of any kind, so it's not being activated by remote. You have a single set of stereo RCA jacks for the signal output and 2 pairs of antenna screw terminals. I actually appreciate how well labeled these are. The only other thing on the back is this tiny switch. That, if you haven't already guessed, is the switch that changes the tuning increment to reflect your region, the Americas or everywhere else. And this machine, unlike the last tuner I covered, applies that change to both AM and FM. And it's not bothered if you switch it while it's powered on. It will just jump to the correct station when you hit the tuner. So that's everything that it does. Now let's open it up so we can answer a few more questions. To get it open, it's the fewest screws that I have dealt with so far on the channel. Only 2. They're on the back. It's this one and this one. Once you get those out, the whole shell lifts right off and you can see the entirety of the PCB. Now there's something conspicuously absent here, and that would be a battery. This cheapo little tuner seems to use non-volatile memory, which means it doesn't need a constant supply of power to hold on to data. Same concept as flash memory and SSDs. This would be the first time that I have seen that in a digital tuner from the 80s. Every other one that I have messed with needed some form of battery backup to store the saved stations. It's interesting to me that this one doesn't, despite its low cost. Next, let's go back to those vertical buttons. Those are just little plastic levers that press your standard tiny momentary switches. In fact, the buttons are all just 2 single pieces of plastic that have been hot pressed into the front with little hinges molded into them, and probably not that easy to fix if they snap off. All right, as we look at the board and internals, here's where I want to point out another cost-saving decision. The secret, if you will. If you remember back to my Hitachi DA1000 video, I said that they had sold the internals to other companies to make their own rebranded version of the same product. Well, in this case, Pioneer has actually done that in-house. This is exactly the same as their TX-055 radio tuner. Now, I'm not sure whether that was the original or this is, but I would wager that this is a rebranding of the 950 because I can find a lot more documentation on that model than I can on this one. Lastly, I'm just going to put up this high-resolution photo of the PCB with all the chips visible in case you want to pause on it and look up any of the numbers to see what they're for. All right, I appreciate you guys sticking around with me on all of these. If all goes well, the next video should be a much more high-end piece of equipment. I'm waiting on a part right now, which should be here in a couple of days, and then I can show it to you. And it actually came with the physical manual, which is always fun. So I hope to see you guys again. Keep thrifting and stay metal.